This is passed to overturn that rule by a large bipartisan vote in the House. I'd like to see that occur in the Senate too. Do look forward. Sometimes we're at odds in terms of what we should do, but there's always practical legislation in the middle, and I'd hope that we can have those conversations that get us there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Braun, thanks very much. Now I'll turn to the introduction of our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Jenny Schutz. Dr. Schutz is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro and works in urban economics and housing policy. Her research focuses on land use regulation, housing prices, urban amenities, and neighborhood change. Thank you for sharing your expertise and experience with us, Dr. Schutz. Our second witness is Ms. Allie Kennington. Ms. Kennington is the Senior Manager of Advocacy and Organizing at the Kelsey, where she leads policy and advocacy efforts to advance disability-forward housing solutions. She's dedicated to fueling justice movements for people with disabilities that are intersectional, sustainable, and intergenerational. Thank you for being here, Ms. Kennington, and sharing your expertise and your experience with the committee. I'll turn next to Ranking Member Braun for an introduction.
My pleasure to introduce Mr. Rick Wajda. He's the CEO of the Indiana Builders Association, one of the state's leading voices on residential construction in the housing industry. Rick has been with the Indiana Builder Association for over 20 years and will share his knowledge and experience with the committee today. He joins us from Fishers, Indiana, not too far from his alma mater, Butler University in Indianapolis. Thanks, Rick, for being here today.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun. Our final witness is Dominique Howell, whom I mentioned earlier. Dominique is an advocate for the civil rights of people with disabilities, and she works to educate others about the discrimination parents with disabilities face. She has personally experienced the barriers that people with disabilities confront in finding accessible housing. Thank you, Dominique, for being here today and for sharing your story with the committee. And now we'll start with Dr. Schutz for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chair Casey, Ranking Member Braun, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the important issue of accessible and affordable housing for older adults and people with disabilities. It's an honor to be here. My name is Jenny Schutz. I'm a senior fellow at Brookings Metro. My comments today will provide some broader context on housing challenges facing older adults and people with disabilities. Restrictive zoning makes it hard to produce enough housing to meet demand, especially accessible and affordable housing. Since the Great Recession, the U.S. has not built enough housing to keep pace with the demand created by job and population growth. Local governments across the U.S. have adopted restrictive zoning rules and complex discretionary development processes that decrease the amount of new construction and increase housing costs. Rules such as single-family exclusive zoning create direct barriers to building accessible homes that meet the needs of people with disabilities and older adults. Accessory dwelling units, duplexes, and apartments in elevator buildings are all critical parts of the housing ecosystem that supports safe, independent living as well as informal caregiving within families. Rising housing costs create more financial stress for low-income households and people living on fixed incomes. The poorest 20% of households spend more than half of their income on housing costs, leaving too little money to cover other necessities. Rapidly rising housing costs are particularly challenging for older adults and people with disabilities who often live on fixed incomes. Among low-income people with disabilities, only 16% receive federal housing subsidies. Two recent trends foreshadow greater housing insecurity among older adults than in previous generations. A larger share of older adults today are renters, due partly to the lingering effects of the foreclosure crisis. Older homeowners also have higher debt levels because they are more likely to have a mortgage and larger mortgage balances. Retrofitting existing homes and communities is essential to improving safety and accessibility. The U.S. housing stock is aging along with the population. Older homes are generally more affordable, but they are also more likely to have maintenance problems that can create unsafe or unhealthy living conditions. Much of the unsubsidized affordable rental housing stock lacks accessibility features, such as elevators and doorways wide enough to accommodate wheelchairs. Retrofitting millions of older homes is an enormous task that will require both private and public capital. An important policy consideration is how to balance the benefits of building codes and related regulations that require accessible features with the costs to property owners of conducting retrofits. Homes are only one piece of the built environment that impacts accessibility. Many older adults and people with disabilities cannot drive, and therefore face challenges safely navigating their communities. Relatively inexpensive and fast infrastructure investments could improve neighborhood safety and accessibility. These include improving sidewalk quality, extending the time allotted for pedestrians crossing streets, and adding benches at bus stops. Removing regulatory barriers to neighborhood-serving retail would also make it easier for older adults and people with disabilities to reach shared community spaces, from shopping centers to libraries and parks. Congress can improve housing accessibility and affordability for older adults and people with disabilities through 4 channels. First, create financial incentives for local governments to revise their zoning to allow a wider range of accessible housing types. The bipartisan infrastructure law includes some models for how to do this. Second, HUD should provide technical assistance and clear guidance to local governments on the types of zoning and building code reforms that are most important to accessibility and affordability. Third, provide flexible financial support for low-income older adults and people with disabilities through increased funding for housing vouchers or targeted tax credits. Fourth, encourage accessibility retrofits for existing homes and neighborhood-serving pedestrian infrastructure through funding already allocated in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Expanding the supply of safe, accessible, affordable housing is a critical quality of life issue for millions of older adults and people with disabilities. Once-in-a-generation federal infrastructure investments offer a unique opportunity to upgrade the safety and accessibility of homes and neighborhoods. Accomplishing these goals will require sustained and coordinated efforts from federal, state, and local governments, as well as the private and nonprofit sectors. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Dr. Schutz, thanks very much for your testimony. Ms. Cannington.
Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the Special Committee of Aging, thank you so much for inviting me to testify today. I sit before you both as senior manager at the Kelsey and as a disabled person who's deeply felt the severe shortage of accessible, affordable, and inclusive housing in my own life and in the lives of people I know and love across the country. Co-led by people with and without disabilities, the Kelsey pioneers accessible, affordable, and inclusive housing through public, private, and philanthropic partnerships to develop mixed-income, disability-forward housing. We also advance market and policy conditions so that this type of housing can become the norm nationwide. Our country's housing crisis disproportionately impacts people with disabilities and older adults. This is why we are here today. And even more acutely, it impacts those who are Black, brown, and indigenous. 1 in 4 adults are disabled, and 2 in 5 seniors have a disability. Disabled people are twice as likely to live in poverty, and no one living on the supplemental security income can afford housing in any U.S. market. People with disabilities experience the highest rates of housing discrimination, and less than 5% of our housing stock is accessible. At least half of those turning to shelters are disabled, and over 18 million people with disabilities are eligible for housing assistance, but not receiving it. Our country still upholds institutional bias, with at least 3.3 million disabled people and older adults stuck in institutional settings because there isn't the housing that they need in their own communities. We have failed millions, but there are tangible solutions that can be enacted now to create what we call a more disability-forward housing future. Disability-forward housing is housing that is affordable to people of all incomes, especially those who are extremely low income. It is accessible, located, designed, and built to meet a diverse range of accessibility needs from cognitive to chronic illness to hearing and vision and more. It is inclusive, which means housing that does not segregate or isolate, but is mixed between people with and without disabilities and supports people to receive access to services in their own homes. Designing disability-forward housing means designing better housing for everyone, people across geographies, incomes, and housing needs. It can include mixed income communities with homes ranging from deeply affordable to essential workforce housing. It includes resident-centered programming that brings elements of interdependence, informal support networks, access to services, and connected community living that benefit all. Designing for all kinds of bodies up front can lower costs. Not planning ahead can lead to unscheduled maintenance and a hit to already limited operating budgets. Disability-forward housing does not have to make a project cost more. When comparing the costs of our projects at the Kelsey to others, ours are cost competitive, proving that this is possible. We have learned through our developments and technical assistance, as well as through the Kelsey's housing design standards for accessibility and inclusion, that with the right partners and investments, disability-forward housing can be scaled to transform the lives of people with and without disabilities from America's city centers to rural communities. We need, though, congressional and regulatory action to make this future possible. We have a legal framework to mandate fair and integrated housing, but we have never adequately invested in the housing infrastructure to make these rights a reality for the ever-growing disabled population. We can improve and invest in programs that we know work but have been woefully underfunded, like HUD Section 811, 202, the HUD Service Coordination Program, Housing Choice Vouchers, including as well as specifically the Mainstream Voucher Program, as well as innovative project-based subsidy programs, as well as transit-oriented development and the Housing Trust Fund, as well as public housing. We must invest in and strengthen Medicaid home and community-based services, including housing-related services. We also can embed a disability-forward solution across the entire housing infrastructure, like within the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC, which funds the vast majority of affordable housing and supports over 6 million jobs annually. Passing legislation like the VITAL Act, Senate Bill 1377, would finance up to 970,000 more affordable, accessible homes over 10 years. It would be a critical step forward. We can increase requirements and incentivize access and inclusion across all federal programs and better align HUD and Medicaid. We can build new programs that make the right to community living for disabled people a reality. This includes creating voucher programs that are more explicitly for disabled people of all ages who qualify for Medicaid home and community-based services. And we can create a national home modification program for people who every day are left to their own accord to make essential changes to their homes. As well as we can establish HUD senior leadership to oversee disability-forward solutions are embedded across the agency. Through all of these interventions and more, you can move us towards a more disability-forward housing future. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cannington. And we'll move now to our fourth witness, Mr. Wajda. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing that right. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. I am pleased to appear before you today on behalf of the Indiana Builders Association to share our views on the state of housing and the barriers our industry is currently facing to provide safe and affordable housing at all price points and for all sectors of the home buying public, including older Americans. My name is Rick Wajda, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the Indiana Builders Association. The Indiana Builders Association represents over 2,600 member companies engaged in the residential and light commercial construction industry across the state of Indiana, and we are also affiliated with the National Association of Home Builders. The primary challenge to the building industry is the lack of attainable, affordable housing in the single-family and multifamily markets. These challenges are consistent across the board for rental units as well as for-sale housing. Indiana has done an excellent job over the years of attracting employers to our communities and making our state a great place to live. But with low inventory and rising material and labor costs, our members are having a difficult time providing workforce housing to Hoosiers. Record low inventory in a building industry that has not met current demand for new housing at various price points has created a shortage of available workforce housing. Estimates indicate a shortage of new homes across the state of 30,000 to 50,000 units. Put into context, Indiana needs roughly 18,000 to 22,000 new houses a year to meet average demand. and only produced over 18,000 new homes in 2020 for the first time since 2007. Why were home builders underbuilding coming out of the recession? After the downturn, the number of home builders declined significantly, and the availability of financing for acquisition, development, and construction activities were severely constrained. These factors significantly limited the production of new housing when housing demand was increasing across the country. According to the National Association of Home Builders Priced Out Report, the 2023 median new home price in Indiana is now $397,000. The income needed to qualify for the median new home price is roughly $120,000. Of the approximately 2.8 million households in Indiana, over 75% are unable to afford the median price of a new home. These numbers hold true across the country as well. In Pennsylvania, 86% of the households are unable to afford the median price of a new home. Ohio, 81%. Nebraska, 75%. Arizona, 81%. The U.S. average is 73% for households unable to afford the median price of a new home. On top of these already challenging dynamics, any increase in housing costs push potential buyers out of the market. In Indiana, for every $1,000 increase in the cost of a house, over 3,000 households are priced out of the market. That number is over 140,000 nationally. Take, for example, inflationary pressures and rising mortgage rates. In March of 2020, the new median house price in Indiana was $296,000, and the interest rate on a 30-year mortgage was roughly 3.5%. Assuming a 20% down payment, the monthly payment, excluding taxes and property insurance, was just over $1,000 a month. Today, that same house costs nearly $400,000, or 34% more, and the interest on that same 30-year mortgage is 7.25%, more than double the rate. As a result of these increases, the new monthly mortgage payment today is over $2,100, $1,100 more a month for roughly the same house. The fact is, homeownership is unattainable for many across Indiana and the country, including two-earner households due to tight supply, inflationary pressures, regulatory costs, and rising mortgage rates. Which is why we must look at reducing the cost of housing at all levels. According to the National Association of Home Builders Economics Group, nearly 25% of the cost of a new home nationwide can be attributed to regulations. Regulations come in many forms and can be imposed by various levels of government. At the local level, jurisdictions may charge permit fees, hookup fees, and impact fees, and establish development construction standards that either directly increase cost to builders and developers or cause delays that translate to higher costs. State and federal governments may be involved in this process directly or indirectly. For example, restrictive building codes add thousands of dollars to the cost of a house, making it that much more difficult to qualify for a mortgage. In terms of identifying solutions to improve affordability, we must rebuild the industry's infrastructure, which includes our labor force and reliable sources of lending and building materials. All regulations should be examined for their impact on housing affordability. Communities can reduce the cost of producing new housing by eliminating fee increases, assist with infrastructure costs, and allowing for higher density housing where the market demands it. Our aging population may want to age in place or age in community. Creativity and options to allow this must be explored and implemented. In Indiana, the General Assembly recently concluded and passed legislation that creates a residential infrastructure fund to the tune of $75 million over the next 2 years to assist in communities building out infrastructure for residential housing. Think sewers, roads, sidewalks, etc. This transformative piece of legislation will open up areas for development and reduce the infrastructure costs currently paid for upfront by the builder-developer, but ultimately passed on in the cost of the home to the home buyer. In conclusion, our citizens, and particularly older Americans, want to choose where they live and the type of home that best meets their needs. Our industry stands ready to assist in helping to expand the availability of safe and affordable housing. Thank you, Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the committee for your time today.
Thank you very much. Our final witness is Dominique Howell.
Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. Thank you for inviting me here today to share my story. My name is Dominique Howell. I am a disability advocate from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I am an independent living specialist at Liberty Resources, Inc., a center for independent living in southeastern Pennsylvania. Today, I am here to speak about the importance of affordable, accessible housing in Philadelphia and nationwide. With a population of 12.90 million residents as of 2021 in Pennsylvania, disabled residents make up at least 25% of the population, which equates to 2,677,350 residents. I feel that it is imperative to focus on the needs of the disability community while also understanding that it is not just a regional issue but a national one. Many of you may have realized that affordable, accessible housing in Pennsylvania does not meet the demands of disabled residents in need. For decades, there has been affordable housing shortage, which has continually led to chronic housing insecurities. This includes homelessness and evictions because many residents cannot afford the rising rent costs on fixed income. For example, last year, the Independent Living Services Department of Liberty Resources, Inc. received an average of 100 calls per month for disabled people needing housing. This is especially true in Philadelphia, including myself. 5 years ago, my family and I, which included my then 3-year-old daughter and my aging grandmother, were wrongfully evicted due to a decision made by the owners of the property. They no longer wanted to make repairs to my inaccessible apartment, which was required by the Philadelphia Housing Authority to continue to receive payments. The owners made the decision that they would no longer accept the subsidy, which led to our eviction because we could no longer afford market rate rent on our own. With the help of some advocacy, my grandmother was able to be housed once we were evicted. Unfortunately, my daughter and I weren't as lucky and were denied entry into the Office of Homeless Services twice because I am a recipient of home and community-based services and receive attended care hours. I receive home and community-based services so that I can remain living independently in the community. The Office of Homeless Services intake staff stated that my attendant could not enter the shelter because of the services I received. After getting legal representation and constant advocating, I was able to enter the shelter, but not without lack of accessibility. For a year, I slept in my power wheelchair, even while in the shelter. After fighting, advocating, and sharing my personal story, my daughter and I now have a place to call home. Even though my daughter and I now have a place to call home, it does not come without accessibility challenges. Unfortunately, even though the building we live in has other tenants with disabilities, the elevator is constantly broken, which leaves many residents, including myself, trapped in our homes, sometimes for weeks on end. My entire life, I had to make the decision between accessibility and affordability, as so many other Americans with disabilities do. As an example, for the first time in my life, I now have a bathroom that is accessible enough for my wheelchair to enter and be able to close the door. As an advocate and activist, personally and professionally, one of my primary focuses is to continue housing justice because housing is a human right, and unfortunately, far too many Americans, especially people with disabilities, are not being equally granted the right of housing they can afford that is accessible. It is my opinion that Pennsylvania and other states across the country should decrease their focus on market value development and increase their efforts to developing affordable, accessible housing to match the needs of its residents. It is my hope that as members of Senate, you decide to take a stance and work diligently to help grant people with disabilities across the United States with their right of affordable, accessible housing. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thanks.
Ms. Howell, thanks very much for your testimony. I wanted to start a round of questions. My first question is for Ms. Cannington. We know that people with disabilities face hardships. I think that's a real understatement. They face those hardships at a rate that is higher than people without disabilities. For example, they're twice as likely to live in poverty, to face a persistent wage gap, and to struggle to afford housing costs. We've got to do more to ensure that federal housing assistance programs are both, as we've said a number of times today, accessible and affordable for people with disabilities. I mentioned LIHTC, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's the nation's primary driver of new stock affordable housing. This is a good program. It's had bipartisan support for many, many years. LIHTC provides tax credits to developers who build new housing for low-income renters, but currently there's no requirement under the program as it exists today to build disability-friendly housing. It's just a gap in the program. The Vital Act that I've introduced would add an accessibility standard for that tax credit program, ensuring that investment in building of new, affordable, and accessible housing is possible. So here's my question, Ms. Cannington. Are states meeting the needs of people with disabilities through the LIHTC program?
Thank you, Senator Casey, for your question. So as you spoke to, LIHTC is the primary driver of affordable housing. And through LIHTC, all states are allocated tax credits. And each state, through their qualified allocation plan, can decide where those tax credits can be prioritized. There are 28 states that completely, at the state level, also lack accessibility requirements. But then there are some states that are leading the way, that are adding both accessibility requirements and incentives. But the bottom line is that disabled people and older adults, no matter where they live in the country, should expect a standard of accessibility in the housing stock. And so by reforming the low-income housing tax credit to both increase the requirement as well as incentivize developers to build more accessible and adaptive housing, the disabled people and older adults will increase our confidence level and the standard, as well as create more uniformity across the development field about what is accessible housing and how can LIHTC ensure that it drives not just affordable housing, but more accessible and adaptable to all.
So you said 28 states
completely lack tax credit accessibility requirements. And then there's 22 states that vary in their accessibility requirements. And so we look to the federal government for leadership in that regard.
Well, that's an interesting breakdown of all the states. I guess one question I have is, what are the characteristics of housing that's designed for the needs of people with disabilities? Kind of describe what would be, for lack of a better word, the ideal circumstance.
Thank you, Chairman. So at the Kelsey, and when we talk about disability forward housing design, we look at cross-disability access. So that means not just meeting the minimum code requirements when they do exist, which is mobility and sensory, so important, but the 61 million disabled people we are an incredibly diverse group. And so we break down those characteristics of access in 6 main impact areas. So hearing and acoustics, vision, health and wellness, cognitive access, and support needs. Some of the features and characteristics that I want to lift up that go beyond code requirements, but by embedding them from the start doesn't have an additional cost, are things like plain language leases, are things like wayfinding in a building that when you implement these accessibility, these cross-disability access characteristics, it doesn't just benefit those groups, but benefits all.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. I'll turn to Ranking Member Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wajda, you talked about in Indiana, the median home price, $397,000. I mean, that just seems outrageously high as a median, and that's actually higher than what the median is across the country. Interest rates, we talked about where they are, but regulation, as it comes from here especially, can you cite a couple of the key regulations that drive costs up? And generally, they're always well-intended, but then can work at cross purposes for the affordability factor. If you would highlight a couple of the most challenging ones from here, and then likewise coming from our own state.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Ron. The regulations are a huge factor, right? If you take you roughly 25% of the cost of a home is due to regulations. I like to say that's no sticks and that's no bricks going into the house. That's simply government regulations that further reduce housing affordability all across this great country. And so if you look at the federal level, it could be regulations dealing with stormwater. A recently Supreme Court decided case, the Sackett case dealing with wetlands on private property, are all regulations that are ultimately added to the cost when a home builder and a developer is looking to develop a piece of ground. They have to take into account those regulations and pass those costs on to the home buyer. That continues to raise the cost of housing. At the local level, a lot of times we see architectural standards baked into local ordinances. So certain communities want housing in their community to look a certain way. They may want all brick houses. They may want certain roof pitches, 3-car side load garages, larger lot densities. Those are all things that we can provide as home buyers to the consumer and to the public, but those come at a cost. And so if we can get creative at the local level and communities can start to look at reducing lot sizes and allowing smaller houses to be built in their communities, we think we can attempt to drive down the cost of housing.
I want to give a shout out to a company in Indiana, the Cook Medical Group, who does medical device manufacturing as its business, but has taken on trying to make affordable housing something that they're going to try to make weigh in on. And in talking to Steve Ferguson, the CEO of the group, he said they found a formula to get housing in a slab home, 3 bedrooms, and I've seen them, and they are nice starter homes for between $185,000, $215,000, which all of a sudden, if you're there, even with today's interest rates, look what you're doing in terms of affordability. I don't know how far that goes into the income quartiles, but if you could do that, and he said the single biggest factor was getting the local jurisdiction to stub in utilities, which most local jurisdictions can, and then it enabled him to be able to experiment to get homes built in that range. Does that happen much across Indiana, or would that be the exception rather than the rule?
I would say, Senator Braun, that's the exception rather than the rule, but it's certainly a creative approach that I think many large employers may want to look. If they need workforce, they're going to need to have some sort of cooperative agreement for housing for their workers. And Senator Braun and Chairman Casey have a lot in common in terms of a long, rich history in your states of the steel mills. And a lot of those communities were built with the assistance of those steel mills back in there to make sure that they had affordable housing for their workers close to the factories. And maybe we've got to take a look at some of those cooperative partnerships moving forward with our employment community.
Well, I think that's one example to where you don't have to look here. You can take that issue into your own hands, and we've had measurable results. I want to get a final question on inflation. That robs across the board purchasing power. It's largely offset any of the wage gains that we've made. COVID exposed a lot of places where employers need to acknowledge that if you don't pay a living wage, you're not only going to be losing the ability to have an affordable home, many other issues as well. I challenge employers throughout the country to make sure to take that into consideration. But what is the current status of inflation impacting building materials? Are we coming back down? Is something within sight of where we'll get back to where we were pre-COVID?
I think, Senator Braun, lumber prices certainly have came back down, but we've seen increases in other building materials that have continued to drive the cost of housing up. We have not seen that stabilize yet, and so as you see, maybe the price of wood and lumber dropping back to some pre-COVID levels, but we've also seen those increases in other products that continue to challenge the market. And certainly you mentioned with mortgage rates going up, right? The challenge to get somebody qualified for an entry-level home in the United States of America is very difficult right now. And so we need to do everything we can to try to drive those rates down and get the cost of materials down so we can build more houses.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ranking Member Braun. I'll start another round of questions. Now, we'll be waiting for, and are waiting for other senators to appear at the hearing so they can do their questions. So we'll have some who will appear in this segment of the hearing. And as some of you might know, we'll have to take, Ranking Member Braun and I will have to take a break to go down to a Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee, so-called HELP Committee, markup where we're considering legislation, pandemic all hazards legislation that we've got to get done today. So we'll take a break and come back, and I think at that point we'll have other senators. But for the time being, I just have a few more for this round. Ms. Howell, I'll start with you. As you know, many people with disabilities and older adults prefer to remain in their homes. As we heard from Ms. Cannington, the current housing stock is largely inaccessible, forcing many to leave their communities for congregate settings, which in many instances would be a nursing home if you're an older adult. We must ensure that older adults and people with disabilities can safely age in place and aren't forced to live in an institutional setting because their home can't support their needs. So Dominique, I would ask you, how does the opportunity to have an accessible home impact your ability to remain in your own home and community?
Well, the opportunity that I've been afforded to have an accessible home has allowed me to be a productive member of society, a great advocate, and an even better mother. Without the opportunity to have an accessible home, I would not be able to do any of those things. I would not be able to be an independent living specialist. I would not be able to fight for housing justice, and I would not be able to be a loving, supportive parent.
That's pretty fundamental, just getting through your day and being a parent. So difficult. I was noting in your testimony that you said at the end of the third paragraph, quote, "I was able to enter the shelter, but not without lack of accessibility. For a year, I slept on my power wheelchair, even while in the shelter," unquote. I can't imagine a year like that, but I hope, and it seems like things are a little better for you today.
Things are wonderful.
That's great.
Full job and a full life, and so I'm blessed. But there are many Americans that are not afforded that opportunity, and so that is why I'm here today.
Yeah.
Thank you for your questions.
And I'll next turn to Dr. Schutz. I wanted to ask you about home modifications, which is part of the discussion here. People with disabilities of all ages need safe housing that supports their ability to live in their communities, but many live in homes not designed for their needs, and often they struggle to afford necessary home modifications like installing a wheelchair ramp or a zero-step shower. These modifications help these Americans prevent accidents and maintain their independence. To help constituents, primarily older adults and people with disabilities, as well as veterans, connect to resources so they can live and age in place, our committee offers a home modification resource guide. I'm just holding it up. It's entitled Modifying Your Home for Accessibility and Safety. And then this particular version says resources for Pennsylvanians. The table of contents kind of says it all. There's a section or a chapter on resources for veterans, resources for rural homeowners, resources for SSI beneficiaries, for older adults, for people with disabilities. Just by way of example, I was looking at the section on resources for rural homeowners. This is how it starts. It says, the Section 504 Home Repair Program provides loans and grants to low-income homeowners to repair, improve, and modernize their homes. It also provides grants to older and very low-income homeowners to improve health and safety standards. So this is particularly focused on Americans who are in rural communities. One of my constituents, Suzanne Ott from Venango County, that's just north of Pittsburgh, told me how her husband uses a wheelchair, but because the doors are not wide enough in their home, he can't use it in the house. She said he has to, quote, crawl on his hands and knees to get inside the house and move around, unquote. Suzanne and her family used the home modifications brochure to find resources to widen their doorways and install stair lifts. She remarked how these changes will allow her husband to, quote, truly be independent, unquote, and to get around and do as he pleases. So, Dr. Schutz, how can we better strengthen and streamline national resources for home modifications?
Thanks for that question. The home modifications are a really important part of making our existing stock more accessible. It's often complicated. As Ms. Cannington said, there are a lot of different kinds of modifications that would be necessary, and it's a question of matching the home characteristics to the resident and to their needs. So it's often hard to come up with a fairly direct sort of cookie-cutter version of this that can be implemented everywhere. We do know that some general rules of thumb for making programs more accessible is, one, to make sure that there's targeted marketing and outreach to eligible households so that they know that these products are available. Second, to make sure that the application process is as easy and straightforward as possible, reduce the administrative burden so it's easy for people to access the resources that they're eligible for. And then third, to make sure that there are trusted intermediaries who can help doing the contracting work to provide good quality work at fair prices and make sure that people aren't overpaying for the services. So those are good general rules of thumb for making the program more accessible and making sure that the funding is spent well.
Thank you, Doctor. Ranking Member Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I do visit all 92 counties in our state, by far the issue I hear, even above and beyond rural broadband, affordable housing, would be workforce. That was pre-COVID. It's probably mentioned twice as often now. In our state, we had 65,000 jobs that needed a better high school education, basic life skills. When I went to high school, you could take engine mechanics, you could take wood or metal shop, you could learn to weld. You had those kinds of parts of your curriculum that I think prepared you, whether you're going to enlist, go into employment right out of high school, or get further education. Where are we at in our own state? I know when I was in the state legislature, it was always talked about. Seemed like we never kind of aggregated our efforts towards it. And how big a deal is it? Do we have enough electricians and plumbers, and let alone all the other kind of skills you need to build a home? How are we doing in Indiana?
Great question, Senator Braun, and the challenges are certainly there in all sectors of the construction industry, whether it's residential construction, commercial construction, road building. You know, for example, our membership in our association was over 7,000 member companies across the state of Indiana before the Great Recession. Now we have shy of 3,000 members. A lot of those companies closed their doors. A lot of those folks went to a different occupation and didn't come back into the construction industry. And we have an aging workforce that is aging out of the construction industry, and we haven't backfilled enough positions with our younger generations that to let them know there are great careers in the construction industry and can make a very good living for themselves and their families if that's the pathway they desire. So we're making a very strong concerted effort with all of our partners in the construction industry, commercial, union, non-union, and residential as well, to let them know there are great careers out there. You can make a very good living. If you choose to go to a four-year institution, that's great, but you don't have to. You can go and become an electrician, a plumber. We need more of those than you can imagine right now. They're in high demand, and if you're willing to get a little dirty and work hard, you can have a great living for yourself and your family.
Well, it's good to let that out there so people know that's a place to go. And where the cost of post-secondary education is gone, it's pricing itself out of the market. We're going to have to, STEM degrees are underproduced in Indiana, for instance, and we need more of them to fill that high demand, very high pay niche. But then you've got high demand, high wage jobs that even through COVID have become more so. And if we, through the guidance that you get in high school, companies need to reach out to their middle schools and high schools to get involved. Garrett High School, for instance, near Fort Wayne, they bought acreage next to their high school, and they build a home each year. And the kids love it. They're going to make more money in many cases than most four-year degrees would produce. And they're going to have a job the day they get their diploma, and a job that can pay for the things you need in this life. So I think education has got to come along to be part of the solution, because if you're not getting enough, you're going to have to pay even more to get people into the field. And I remember too, Indiana Manufacturers Association, they wanted just the school system to produce that perfect employee mix that they needed. Well, that wasn't happening. That was as recently as 8 years ago. I see that occurring too. And some of the companies that are having the least amount of trouble hiring people are communicating with their local school systems. And then kids, they get those general life schools, and the parents get the information of high demand, high wage, cost of education, career wages. We can do a better job of getting people in places where we need it, and housing would be one of those places. It seems like we got a lot of room to improve as well, but it does look like we're making steps in the right direction.
Senator, I would agree, and right, as I mentioned earlier, with the loss of so many subcontractors and building industry professionals coming out of the last recession, if you're a residential home builder and you call 5 plumbers and get quotes for a project, you're going to get a competitive bid. Today, there might only be 1 plumber in town to give you that bid, and so all those factors go into the affordability challenges that we're seeing today. Is we need more workers, we need more competition to try to continue to drive that cost of providing that service.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun. As I said, now we'll take a break. The committee will recess until 11 a.m. foundation. The committee will now resume the hearing. Laying the foundation, housing accessibility and affordability for older adults and people with disabilities. I'll turn to my colleague, Senator Kelly, because he was here when I walked in the door, and he's, as always, on time. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Schutz and Ms. Cannington, Mr. Wadja, did I pronounce that right? And Ms. Howell, thank you, all of you, for being here today. This is a very important issue. And this question's for Dr. Schutz. So my state, the state of Arizona, is currently dealing with a rather historic heat wave, multiple days in a row in Phoenix, where the temperature has hit at least 110 degrees. The other day when I was there, it was 118. And it's been above 110 pretty much every day of the month here in July. And the National Weather Service indicates that temperatures are going to remain above average for the rest of the month. And you've probably seen some of these headlines, and I expect you've also seen headlines on the study that found out that if there's a blackout in Phoenix during a heat wave, 50% of the city's population could possibly need emergency medical attention. And Phoenix has a population of over, Maricopa County's about half the population of the state, so over 3 million people. Now, we are fortunate that Phoenix has a pretty strong electrical grid, but these extreme weather events are happening more frequently. And the low temperatures aren't really that low anymore. And we know that older adults are at risk due to extreme heat. And if you're in an older home, you're more likely not to have air conditioning. We've seen that last week with some individuals. You're also not likely to have effective insulation in an older home, or you're not likely to have window shading, all of which can become very dangerous in these times of extreme heat. The federal government, by the way, supports weatherization assistance, which can make homes safer and better prepared to respond to extreme weather events. But Dr. Schutz, are we maximizing the use of these resources from the federal government that supports weatherization assistance?
That's a great question. Thanks, Senator Kelly. The short answer is no. We're not doing a great job of getting the weatherization money into the hands of people who need it and into homes to provide all the sorts of adaptive features that you mentioned. We talked before the recess that there are a number of ways that, in general, home retrofits could be made easier. The weatherization program is undersubscribed. A lot of people who would be eligible for assistance don't know that they're eligible and so don't apply. It's a very onerous process to apply and get access to that, to go through the screening process for income, to have the home energy audit done. And so thinking about ways to make that easier to access. This also should work nicely with some of the funding in the Inflation Reduction Act that's more focused on energy efficiency, but the two of those together, so things like insulation and replacing windows and doors, upgrading heating and cooling systems, particularly cooling systems in Arizona, those are really important for making the homes safer and healthier for people, and bringing down also energy usage so that people are spending less on their energy bill and the system stays current.
Have there been any surveys done to try to determine how many, like what percentage of the population that's eligible even know that these programs exist?
I would have to look to see. I mean, the programs are pretty undersubscribed. Each state administers the weatherization assistance program a little bit differently. And so some states have been more proactive about doing outreach. Maryland has done quite a lot of that to encourage people who are eligible to know about it. But that's a great question. I can look up those figures for you.
Okay, thank you. And or Dr. Schutz, on a different but somewhat related subject, you know, one of the things I hear from affordable housing stakeholders all the time is the need for zoning reform to allow for some creative solutions to build new affordable housing. And I had some folks in my office just yesterday, including a woman who has been homeless. And we were discussing, how do we get more affordable housing in the state of Arizona. One of the suggestions and one of the things that came up, was something that Tucson, Arizona locally did, which was allowing for the construction of accessory dwelling units, ADUs, on single-family properties, but that's not statewide. And these independent living situations are popular and carry a lot of benefits, including proximity to family caregivers, to support older adults and individuals with disabilities. So Dr. Schutz, in your testimony, I understand you highlighted how zoning rules that prohibit all structures except single-family detached homes create direct barriers to building accessible homes. So recognizing that so much of housing policy happens at a state and local level, can you expand on your recommendations for how the federal government can support or incentivize state and local efforts to pursue zoning reform?
Absolutely. There's actually a lot of experimentation going on at the state and local level, places like Tucson, states like Utah that have been doing state-level reform. And one of the really useful things that HUD could do is keep track of all of the reforms that are going on, make sure that the lessons we're learning for what works and what doesn't in different housing markets is accessible, providing really simple, straightforward guidance. If you want to make ADUs work, here's a 2-pager of the do's and don'ts, so that state and local officials can get access to that. There's a lot of interest by elected officials at the state and local level in learning more about how this works, and there isn't really a good source of information or technical assistance. That would be a very easy thing that HUD could do more of, in combination with targeting some of the transportation and infrastructure funds to encourage more zoning reform.
And we could probably do that even without legislation, I would think. I mean, just encouraging HUD to do that. So I'll make sure that my staff works with you and we can try to address this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. So turn next to Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I want to build on what Senator Kelly was talking there with regard to zoning. Owning a home is part of the American dream. And when I talk to my constituents, specifically in Omaha, who are home builders, one of the challenges they talk to me about is all the extra red tape that has come over the past several years with regard to, not only the zoning, but all the regulations that go along with the codes and so forth like that. And that's creating a barrier to building affordable housing that would impact our seniors. And so, Mr. Wajda, you're with home builders as well. A lot of my constituents tell me that the regulations they face are local examples of what the state or the federal government is promoting, and that's creating some of the costs and the burdens that they face. Can you talk to me a little bit about what can the federal government be doing to maybe help with cutting that red tape and helping our home builders build more affordable homes?
Sure, Senator Ricketts, thank you for the question. And a great example at the federal level is uncoupling some legislation that has been passed that requires states and local communities to adopt the most recent edition of the building codes. For example, the adoption of the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code can add as much as $31,000 to the price of a new home and can take as long as 90 years for homeowners to see a payback on their investment. At a time when we're facing an affordability crisis across the country, passing the most recent edition of an updated energy code, which does very little to increase the energy efficiency in already efficient new construction. I think we could see as a country much bigger bang for your buck looking at retrofitting some of those older homes, as we talked about in some of the weatherization programs and others that could really increase energy efficiency but not saddle potential new home buyers of new homes from those increased costs.
Was there a cost-benefit analysis done on that? I mean, because the numbers you're giving are pretty shocking that would increase the cost of a home by that much when there are lower cost, readily available ways to be able to help improve on energy efficiency. Was there cost-benefit analysis done on that?
I think they look at some of those things, and most codes are then adopted. The international codes are then adopted by states uniformed, or they make tweaks to those depending on which state you're from and/or in local communities. So a lot of states and local communities may take the international code and then change that to try to reduce those cost increases at their local level. But, we work very closely with our national association to make sure that policymakers are aware of when new regulations are going to be passed, what that impact is going to be on their constituents in their home states.
And when you say international code, help educate me on that. Why is it called an international code?
It's the International Code Council is a code writing body. It's a nonprofit organization that actually writes the codes, and then states adopt those international codes in their states. But it is a group of folks that get together to promulgate, write new codes, and ultimately sell code books.
And so who are they accountable to?
They have a governing body.
And who's that? Who makes up that governing body?
Various interest groups and local government officials typically.
So it's not an elected official body that's overseeing that is...
Could be the local building inspector, could be from a community that's on the ICC board. Varied interest. A lot of times maybe they're looking at safety and not necessarily safety and affordability.
Mm-hmm. And you said there was also, so is there also potential for conflict of interest there from that standpoint of the people who are sitting on that, who are creating these codes that may then benefit from the codes that they're creating?
I think a lot of the things that we hear from our members of our organization is a lot of product manufacturers are very engaged in the code writing process, and a lot of times that if you add a product to the code that could increase the cost of housing, obviously then local states and local communities have to look at that and say, is this something that we want in our home state? And a lot of times we have to then pull that section out of the code or learn to live with it and pass the cost on to the potential home buyer.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way to, do you have any thoughts on how to reform that process?
I think having a more balanced approach so that you have all sectors of the residential construction industry at the table with an equal voice, and making sure that we're taking into account not only safety but also affordability, and as you mentioned earlier, really taking a look at that cost-benefit analysis of every new edition of the code that's going to be promulgated to make sure that the people that are going to be enforcing those new regulations understand the cost they're passing on to their constituencies.
Great. Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Ricketts. We'll turn next to Senator Warnock.
Thank you very much, Chair Casey. In addition to the Aging Committee, I also serve on banking and housing. And it's exciting to see those two committees intersect on such an important issue. Over the past year, I've been working to improve the low-income housing tax credit, or better known as LIHTC. Ms. Cannington, how do states meet the needs of people with disabilities through the LIHTC program?
Thank you so much, Senator Warnock, for your question. So, as I spoke to in my testimony, LIHTC, as the nation's primary driver of affordable housing, is impacting positively the supply of affordable housing across the country. And yet, there are still gaps in the program in that it does not uphold a standard of accessibility that people with disabilities and older adults need across the country. Through federal guidance, both and reform, we can create incentives and requirements within LIHTC to ensure that regardless of the state that an individual lives in, that they can expect that there is going to be a supply of housing that is more accessible and adaptable. There also is a need for more data transparency and data collection. We know that less than 5% of our nation's housing stock is accessible. We know that disabled people and older adults experience poverty at higher rates and need accessible housing, and so the supply of affordable, accessible housing is even less. And so how can we ensure that the largest driver of affordable housing, LIHTC, really gives us an understanding of the supply that it's rehabbing and constructing, and noting what that supply, how that supply is meeting the needs as well as not meeting the needs of Americans across the country.
So lack of inventory, availability of affordable housing for people in general, particularly marginalized populations, and then persons dealing with that at the intersection of disabilities, that supply is even lower.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of work to do, and that's why last year I introduced the Housing Market Data Transparency Act, which requires state housing finance agencies to submit data annually about properties receiving. Ms. Cannington, how could better data about the LIHTC program inform better policies and improve the lives of Americans aging in place and adults with disabilities?
Thank you again for that question, Senator. So as we know, and your legislation speaks to, multiple GAO reports have suggested that Congress should consider designating an agency to regularly collect and maintain specified cost-related data. And we need to ensure that the data also collected is related to both levels of affordability and accessibility. So that, for example, Congress can then connect data on the number of homes funded by LIHTC based on AMI to track how the program serves people across incomes. That can also be the same in regards to accessibility. We need more research to be done and more attention to access and inclusion across the housing infrastructure. And if LIHTC, which is the primary driver of affordable housing, is really not taking into consideration the needs of the largest minority in this country, we're missing the mark.
Well, thank you so much. I agree, and I believe that increasing program transparency and data integrity of the LIHTC program would further underscore the program's record of success and allow us to have more accurate data. And this is not data for data's sake. Improved data transparency in the LIHTC program would then help inform policies and meet the needs of people with disabilities and Americans aging in place. Thank you so much for your advocacy on this issue and for your testimony today.
Thank you, Senator Warnock. I know we're awaiting, I think, at least one more senator, but so I'll ask another question. I want to note for the record something I didn't do earlier. I mentioned the Modifying Your Home for Accessibility and Safety. This new publication, this version is for Pennsylvania, but it's also been translated into Spanish, so we have that resource available. I'll turn for my question to Dominique Howell. As you mentioned in your testimony, if your home is properly accessible, it can make an immense difference and allow you to live independently and be integrated into your community. People with disabilities have historically been underrepresented in property development, and the expertise and leadership of people with disabilities is critical to the creation of more accessible homes. Your lived experience and work highlight the need for more people with disabilities to be included in the conception of and development of affordable and accessible housing. So housing is made better for all Americans. Can you share the importance of including the voices of people with disabilities and advocates in housing development?
Thank you for your question, Chairman. First and foremost, I think that representation matters. So we need to be at the table so that people can see us and know our stories and know what accessibility looks like firsthand, whether it's physical, whether it's cognitive, whether you're a deaf individual. And I think that if we are at the table and we help develop it, it will help design and create more affordable housing the best way we know how. If you live the experience, you know the experience. So you're the best person to develop it because you know what you need as a disabled individual.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Dr. Schutz, I wanted to turn to you again. We know that many older adults provide care for their grandchildren, grand families as we've come to know them. these older adults may not have the physical infrastructure features in their home to accommodate raising a young child. Features include single-floor living, zero-step entrances, and hallways and doorways wide enough to accommodate wheelchairs, walkers, or strollers. And these not only make homes more accessible for older adults, but also for young children. As we've learned today, finding housing that meets this criteria is challenging. I've introduced bipartisan legislation called the Grand Family Housing Act, which would support housing providers in creating stable living environments for grand families and kinship families. Doctor, how can we better support the accessible housing needs of multi-generational families, particularly those who are raising young children?
That's a great question, Senator. We know that people have figured out ways to live in extended families and multi-generational families forever. People figure out ways to do this organically. But many of the rules that we've been talking about at the local level, zoning rules, make it hard to build the kinds of homes that accommodate that. So a very typical example used to be you would buy a duplex or a triple-decker house and have different parts of the same family live together and provide care, but have different units. We've talked some today about accessory dwelling units, which are a great way to provide a unit on the same property that can either accommodate a caregiver, adult children, older adults who want to live with their younger children. So these kinds of diverse structures provide an ecosystem of housing that supports a lot of choices. And if we take away some of the regulatory barriers and allow these to be built, including allowing conversions to happen in existing properties, then we provide a wider range of options and people can choose the option that works best for themselves and their families.
Thanks very much. Senator Ricketts, do you have any other questions?
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You'll have to tell Senator Braun I was trying to schmooze him while he was supposed to be here for this, so I could say I was wanted to compliment him on his introduction and his leadership of the Middle Class Borrower Protection Act, which I co-sponsored, but he's not here, so you have to tell him that I was trying to compliment him when he wasn't.
I'll make sure to do that.
Thank you. But it is concerning when the administration wanted to change the loan-level pricing for families that you're essentially taxing the American dream. You're rewarding people who weren't making as good the financial decisions and punishing people who were doing the right thing with regard to their financial decisions, who had better credit scores and so forth. And that's obviously very concerning. Mr. Wadja, in your opinion, what specific impact analysis or studies should be done before you make changes like this that are going to change this single-family pricing framework?
Senator Ricketts, thank you very much for your question. Our National Association expressed concern about the increased upfront delivery fees for many borrowers with the new LLPA matrices when they came out in May of this year. Whether it's paid as a closing cost fee or through increased interest rates, increasing the LLPAs only serve to act as a tax on home ownership in an extremely vulnerable market. However, our industry believes that Congress should remain focused on the comprehensive reform of the housing finance system and certainly understand that when those fees are passed on, right, there is a cost to home ownership across the country.
So what sort of collaboration or input should be received before making changes like this? Like, how would you structure this to advise the administration before they make changes in this kind of policy?
Senator Ricketts, I think having that discussion with the various stakeholders and how it's going to impact certainly the housing industry as a whole, bringing those stakeholders into those conversations and having that dialogue on the front end, we certainly could have had that conversation to make sure any change in what that impact was going to be on housing affordability.
To your knowledge, do you know of any sort of collaboration, input, forums, public meetings, anything like that the administration did before considering this?
I certainly have to check with our National Association staff on that and whether there was any collaboration between those organizations.
So, but you're not aware of any personally?
None to my knowledge, no, sir.
That went on that. And so what kind of implications do you think this would have for housing affordability if this rule were in place?
I think certainly any fees that are passed on have to be, whether it's passed on in the cost of a mortgage or passed on to the home builder and ultimately to the home buyer, any increase in the cost of housing is going to price people out of the market.
So it's going to actually lead to less accessibility rather than more accessibility.
Correct.
Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ricketts. I'll move to my closing statement for the hearing, and if our colleague arrives, they can be slotted in before we adjourn. And I want to thank Senator Ricketts for coming back to the hearing and also standing in for Senator Braun. We're grateful for that. It's a busy Thursday. We have multiple competing committees all at the same time, so we're grateful for his work. So as we conclude the hearing on accessible and affordable housing for older adults and people with disabilities, it's imperative that we understand the need for stable, high-quality housing to ensure the well-being of older Americans and Americans with disabilities. Today's witnesses have talked about the importance of increasing the stock of accessible and affordable homes, as well as embedding accessibility into housing standards. Accessible housing includes features people may need to live independently, like wider doorways, clear floor space for wheelchairs to move throughout the home, low countertops, assistive technology, and grab bars in bathrooms. Accessible design is essential to ensure the inclusion and active participation of all people in society. Accessible housing that ensures all people have access to a home they can live in, and as we've heard today, living in well-fit homes ensures community engagement, professional opportunities, and educational options. But building accessible homes requires joint efforts in the active participation of everyone from people with disabilities to developers to advocacy organizations to federal and state governments. And the unfortunate reality is that millions of older Americans and people with disabilities see accessible housing only as a dream. People like Dominique, who said, quote, "My entire life I've had to make a decision between accessibility and affordability, as so many other Americans with disabilities do daily," unquote. No one should have to make that choice. Dominique's comment, as well as the ones made by other witnesses, reinforces the lack of accessible homes and the challenges older adults and people with disabilities face when trying to find and pay for these homes. The 5% of national housing stock with even basic accessible features is clearly inadequate when 26% of our fellow Americans have a disability. I mentioned earlier the VITAL Act, which incentivizes the building of affordable homes that are also accessible. As members of Congress, we must continue to commit to ensuring investment to increase the stock of accessible and affordable housing to meet the needs of millions of people with disabilities and older adults. So I want to thank you for your testimony, and I will now turn to Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding this hearing today. Such an important topic. The housing shortage is a national emergency that lies at the root of what makes buying or renting a home the single largest line item in most families' budgets so wildly unaffordable to too many Americans today. We know how to solve the problem. We need to build more housing. And not just more housing, but more of every kind of housing. Housing for seniors, housing for people with disabilities, housing for veterans, housing for families with children, housing for single people, housing for first-time buyers, and on and on. That undoubtedly will require new housing development and construction, and I believe we need serious federal dollars to help make this happen. But there are also things that we can do to make the most of the construction that we already have. For example, towns all across this country are taking a look at their unused non-residential properties like office space or long-abandoned public buildings to see if those spaces could better be used to serve their communities as housing. Dr. Schutz, you have extensive experience studying the housing market. Now, property conversions may not work everywhere all the time, but we are seeing communities successfully using housing conversions to create accessible and affordable housing for some groups. Are you seeing this as a way to produce more housing for older Americans, for people with disabilities, and for other groups?
Absolutely. Conversion of non-residential buildings to housing can add substantial amounts of housing. If we look at cities like Los Angeles, for instance, the downtown converted a lot of empty office buildings, and they work really well for accessible units because they're already tall buildings equipped with elevators, so they can work really well in some contexts.
Yeah. You know, I want to say we're doing some of this in Massachusetts right now. Over the last few years, we've seen creative projects to convert existing non-residential construction to homes for older Americans and for the broader population. In New Bedford, a 114-year-old textile mill is being converted into apartments for lower and middle income adults aged 55 and older. In Salem, I'm going to say this wrong. In Salem, 2 century-old Catholic schools are being converted to a mixed-income apartment for seniors and artists. And earlier this month, Boston Mayor Michelle Wu announced a bold pilot program to immediately create residential housing out of unused office space. And there's a lot of it, with about 1 in 5 of every commercial office buildings in downtown Boston currently vacant. Federal investment in converting formerly non-residential properties into housing could help more communities expand their housing supply in a way that fits the needs of target populations, like older adults who need accessible and centrally located homes. Accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, another tool that communities can use to get the most out of their existing construction. These units tend to be on the smaller side, something that homeowners can build on their own property and then use it as rental housing. Think of a mother-in-law unit on the back of the lot, or maybe an efficiency apartment over a garage. Dr. Schutz, could you say a word about how accessory dwelling units help address the housing shortage, especially among older adults?
Accessory dwelling units can fit in a couple of ways. They can provide a space on the property for a caretaker to live, or they can provide a space for adult children to move in. I would point to both California and Utah as states that have done a lot to push making accessory dwelling units easier to build at the state level.
Ms. Cannington, would you like to add to that? You seem engaged in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Senator. I just want to add the importance of both a carrots and sticks approach to the affordable, accessible, and inclusive housing crisis that we have. It is essential that we have accessibility requirements that accurately reflect the needs of the growing disabled and older adult population. But the bottom line is, without incentives, the developer field will only continue to see access as a compliance issue. But what we know is that access is an opportunity for everyone to thrive at levels that we have really never been able to fully realize in this country.
I think that's a really powerful point here. You know, this is something where my view on this is more. We need more. In the last few years, several towns on Cape Cod have agreed to reform their zoning laws to allow for the creation of ADUs to boost the supply of year-round housing for residents. Local advocacy groups have stepped up to provide modest financial incentives and practical assistance to homeowners to help them get ADUs in place. I get it. ADUs and conversions may not work everywhere. Every community's housing stock is different and particular needs are different. And there's no getting around the need for a major federal investment if we want to close the housing gap. But we can also help move the needle with more targeted federal investments that support and expand communities' efforts to boost their housing stock and to ensure that everyone, and I want to underline everyone, has access to safe, accessible, and affordable place to live. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Warren, thanks very much, and thanks for being with us today. I'll wrap up by saying that I want to start by thanking each of our witnesses for their time today, their testimony, the experience, both life experience as well as professional experience. And I also want to thank you for your patience in allowing us to have a break in between so Senator Braun and I could get to the help hearing. I will be submitting 9 additional statements for the record from various constituents and stakeholders from Pennsylvania who have experienced issues with finding accessible and affordable housing and are calling on the need for more development. If any senators have additional questions for the witnesses or statements to be added to the record, the hearing record will be kept open for 7 days until next Thursday, July 27th. Thank you all for participating today. This concludes our hearing.